Welcome to Lumar, one of the most alien worlds in the entire cosmere. This uniquely dangerous world features 12 moons that constantly drop spores onto the surface, creating 12 spore seas. Long considered to be a backwater planet, Lumar's future in the cosmere looks to be an important one. This video will dive into the geography of the planet as well as the culture of the Lumarans and their role they might play in the future of the cosmere. We'll also be going over the spores and how the fluidized spore seas work.
I'll be sourcing the bulk of the information used in this video from Tress of the Emerald Sea, but I'll also be pulling some additional information from Isles of the Emberdark, the Ars Arcanum for the Stormlight Archive, and some words of Brandon.
I'll try to avoid story spoilers where I can, but where I can't, I will provide a timestamp for where to skip to.
Nearly every aspect of life on Lumar is shaped in some way by the presence of one of the moons. These celestial bodies float in geosynchronous orbits above the planet far closer than is natural or possible without something magical going on. These ever-present heavenly spheres are the source of the spore oceans that cover the majority of the surface of the planet.
The aether spores dropped from these moons are unique in the cosmere. In their more common form, aethers are entities that bond to chosen individuals, exchanging water from their bodies for access to power. However, the spores on Lumar are activated by water, but their growth is a lot more voracious. The spores on Lumar react violently and explosively when exposed to water. However, they don't form a Lou-Hell bond when activated. That is, with one notable exception. If you want to learn more about the Lou-Hell bond, I did make a video on that, connection bonds in the cosmere. There will be a card in that corner right there if you want to learn more.
The growth of these aether spores can be deadly. Hoyd provides a lovely description of what it's like to have one of these verdant aethers grow through someone's mouth. In case you have a more limited imagination, it begins with a feeling like hands forcing your jaws apart. Then vines fill your throat, growing wherever they can find space, snaking down into your lungs. They knock loose teeth and drill up through your soft palate and into your sinuses. They don't usually reach your brain though, so you get the pleasure of suffocating to death as you feel the vines rip your eyes from their sockets. You're welcome.
These nearly omnipresent spores are not unstoppable. They have two weaknesses, salt and silver. Salt and silver stop the killer.
Silver seems to work in something like an area of effect, killing spores that get too close to it. Silver also has a similar effect on full-grown spore constructs, which degrades and severs their growth. Putting spores in an aluminum box can protect them from the decaying influence of silver nearby.
Thankfully, silver is an abundant resource here on Lumar, probably more than is natural, which is really interesting to me because there's another planet in the cosmere where silver is super important to keeping people alive, and that's Threnody. I wonder if there's a deeper connection here, because when a shade attacks a person, it seems to drain that person of their water, leaving them a shriveled husk. And spores and the Lou-Hell bond exchange water for power. So aside from the silver connection, there also seems to be a water draining element connecting these two. All right, so there's been a bit of a development since I shot this video. Since I shot this video, I had the opportunity to ask Sanderson a question at a Q&A at FanX. And the question and response is relevant to this video, so check it out. My question is, are shades pulling water from their victims through the same mechanic as the Lou-Hell bond, and are shades damaged by salt in the same way that aether spores are?
I'm gonna say you are theorizing on the correct direction. They are pulling water in a very similar way. But whether salt will give you a RAFO card on, so you get to be RAFO'd.
So, while it's not like explicit confirmation that the shades are operating through a Lou-Hell bond, it is confirmation that they're pulling water from their victims, which is not something we knew before. And, you know, getting a RAFO for the salt question was pretty cool too. So Viola case, yeah, you were right. I was fishing for a answer related to a video I was working on. Good job. Another update that's happened since I shot this video is I have 2 more draconic donors that I didn't shout out when I was filming at Lumar. So special thanks to Dennis, Matt, Matthew, and Alex. Okay, back to the video.
Salt also kills spores. For this reason, salt mining is a key resource and an important industry to the people of Lumar. Some people even drink salty tea, and in other places, people wear salt-encrusted masks to help prevent accidental inhalation of spores.
Different spores are dangerous in different ways. For example, verdant vines that come from verdant aether spores are dangerous in a way that's different from the chitinous spikes that are created from crimson spores. There are 12 different kinds of aethers making up the spores of the spore seas. And of these 12, we only know of 6 that are confirmed. However, we can speculate on what the other 6 might be.
The The 6 known types of aethers are verdant from the Emerald Sea, zephyr from the Sapphire Sea, crimson from the Crimson Sea, rose from the Rose Sea, midnight from the Midnight Sea, and sunlight spores, which are presumably from the Sunlight Sea. Verdant spores create vines, zephyr spores create air and atmosphere, crimson spores create red spikes, rose spores create a pink quartz-like mineral called rosite, sunlight spores create a sort of fire and light, and midnight spores create midnight essence constructs.
While we only know what half of them will be, there is a direction that we can theorize. They might line up with the 10 essences from Rochar, because Sanderson has said that they do kind of line up, but it might not be one-to-one. So take this with a pinch of copper, but that's the direction we're going to be theorizing in the next section. It's important to note that there are 10 essences, but only 12 types of aethers, so that doesn't necessarily mean that every aether has a corresponding essence from Rochar, but maybe they do, and I'll talk more about that in a minute.
The 10 essences of Rochar are Zephyr, Vapor, Spark, Lucentia, Pulp, Blood, Tallow, Foil, Talus, and Sinew. Of the 6 known types of aether, they all mostly seem to line up pretty well. Zephyr aether produce gas like Zephyr essence in soul casting. Verdant aether makes plants like the pulp essence can on Rochar. Even the crimson aether, which creates sharp red spikes, has an essence counterpart, and it's a weird one. The essence counterpart to crimson aether is sinew, the essence of flesh and meat.
A lot of the aether spores, or all of them that we've seen, map fairly neatly to a primal essence or element. And so we're wondering if that's a continued pattern. What's the essence for the crimson aether? Or to put it another way, what's with the red spikes? The world wants to know.
Spikes? So red spikes are the aether version of coral, which is I did not, let's just say, want to do a flesh aether. So let's just put you there. So we're going in a coral direction as our kind of organic-ish, fleshy sort of thing. Do understand they're not going to be a one-to-one, right? We might have some wiggle room there, but so far I've done them as a one-to-one.
This wob would indicate that the aethers do line up with the 10 essences in some way, but Brandon has also mentioned that he wants to have some wiggle room.
Working off this information, I think it's safe to say that sunlight aether and spark are closely related, and rosite and lucentia are as well. The only aether type that doesn't line up with an essence is midnight. There is no midnight essence in soul casting. But there is undoubtedly a midnight essence known on Rochar. However, this may just be an example of something that is actually a cosmere-wide phenomenon. Different magic systems coming to the same conclusion, but not sharing an origin.
Well, I think this is an interesting direction to theorize. I don't know if it's necessarily the case, and like I mentioned, take it with a pinch of copper, because the crimson spores being, the meat spore, the chitin, that does indicate that this is a valid direction to theorize, but there's also some mechanical issues if it lines up. For example, if there were blood spores, we know that blood activates other spores, so if one were to activate, the entire ocean would become liquid in a chain reaction covering the entire surface of Lumar. So that can't work. Each sea provides a view that you can't get anywhere else in the cosmere. I mean, just look at that. That's incredible. You can't find that anywhere else. The moons, the sea, it's just incredible. I'm here on an uninhabited island in the Rose Sea, one of the safer inhabited seas. And yeah, aside from the deadly spores back here, it's quite lovely. To the Lumarans who live here, these sights are commonplace, but isn't that the case for anyone who lives somewhere beautiful?
There are 3 known inhabited seas, but it is implied that other seas are also inhabited. These 3 seas are the Emerald, the Sapphire, and the Rose Sea. In the book, all of the Lumarans we meet are from just 2 of the 12 seas, the Emerald and the Sapphire Sea. The people of these 2 seas share some cultural identity and even speak the same language called Clycian.
The Emerald Sea is governed by a king who lives on the King's Island in the Core Archipelago. From his throne, the king presides over dukes who reign over islands, making this a pre-industrial feudal system with a heavy emphasis on seafaring, sporefaring, sea travel.
But where do the people get their food? Thankfully, not all of the islands on Lumar are as small and as salty as Diggins Point. There are some islands that are larger than 60 miles across and able to support forests and lakes. The animal life on Lumar is similar to that of Scadrial and other Earth analog Cosmere planets, albeit with seemingly less biodiversity. They have crows, rats, salmon, seagulls, pigeons, and cats. They also have garlic and potatoes, bread made from flour, and ale. And if we're to believe the story of the Tosher actually takes place on the King's Island as Hoid implies, they also have access to corn and milk, which could imply the existence of some sort of livestock to get that milk from.
This list of crops makes me think that there is some sort of large-scale organized agriculture going on these islands, as well as lumber and textile industries. Furthermore, Tress does mention that her island, Diggins Point, they have compost vats for growing things.
Over in the Sapphire Sea, on the island of Lobu, we find a culture of hunters. What they hunt varies person to person. Apparently, they realize that an entire culture of hunters doesn't scale well, so they changed the definition of what a hunt is. In the case of Fort, he hunts for deals. Regardless of what is hunted, the people of Lobu take pride in their hunts and how diligently they seek their prey.
The Rose Sea is known to be inhabited, but we don't know anything about the culture of the people who live there from the books. And I wish I could tell you more, given that I'm here. I'm just on one of the uninhabited islands, so I'll have to get back to you. Oh, and take a look at this. So you know how behind me is the Rose Sea? Well, I had to repurpose an allomancy vial for this, but I have some rose spores here. So what we're gonna do is a little demonstration. Let me put this glove on because I'm kind of sweaty. I've also got this flask filled with water because I prefer water for my allomantic metals. Again, another thing I had to repurpose here. Sweet, let's put that lid back on very carefully. So I have just a couple rose aether spores in my hand. And then I've got my flask here. We'll just do a couple of drops. All right, and there we go. There are some activated rosite spores. This is what activated rosite spores look like. It's kind of a rose quartz pinkish crystal. And that's from aether spores. Now, before I came out here, I had one of my Silverlight friends who is bound to the Silejana, the rose quartz aether, give me just a little bit of her crystal. Comparing them side by side is interesting. They are definitely different in shape. The crystal that my friend gave me is much more deliberately grown. Different color too. I mean, they're still like the same substance. Still, that's fascinating. This rosite crystal grew. I also didn't have to send any mental command or images to the rose spores for it to grow into a crystal. It just did that on its own, growing in accordance to how much water it received. But anyway, how neat is that? Let me put these away real quick. While spore growth is explosive, it is predictable. You can guess approximately how much a spore will grow depending on how much water is given, which is very important for spore-related devices. Spores also have an upper limit for their growth. At a certain point, they'll become saturated and stop growing, which is very important for something like verdant spores, which can be used as a food source once they have stopped growing.
This knowledge is important in World for a couple of reasons. Devices powered by spore reactions need to be quantifiable and repeatable. Verdant vines grown from spores can also serve as an emergency, low-calorie food source only when the vine has been fully saturated and stops growing.
Spore growth can also be affected by metals, and we've only seen two of them used in the book, which are iron and steel. And if you know anything about allomancy, what they do to spores shouldn't be a surprise. Obviously, steel will push spore growth away from the plate, and iron will attract the spore growth towards it. The spiritual integrity of metal strikes again. But 300 years before the events of this book, there was another culture that called Lumar home, and these are the Iriali, which you might recognize from the Stormlight archive. I'm not going to talk about the Iriali much in this video. They deserve their own video, so we'll just add it to the list with Nightblood and Hemalurgy and let's see, what else? Dragons, yeah. So we'll just throw Iriali on the list as well.
Anyway, the Iriali vanished 300 years ago, around the same time the dragon Xysis arrived on the planet. They left behind empty homes and islands as well as various possessions that became anthropological artifacts. We don't know how long the Iriali were on Lumar, or if this group of Iriali is the same one that lived on Roshar. There could be various different groups of Iriali all along their own versions of the long trail throughout the cosmere. But if I had to guess, I think that they were, at least in some part of the group that left Roshar. If this is the case, they couldn't have been on Lumar for that long. Tress of the Emerald Sea certainly takes place after Book 5 of the Stormlight Archive, which couldn't have been more than 500 years before this book takes place due to some dates in Isles of the Emberdark and its connection to this book, among other things. This would mean that the Iriali left Roshar and went to Lumar and stayed there for no more than 300 years before vanishing again. A far cry from the thousands of years they spent on Roshar.
Also, I don't think that the Iriali went to Scadrial after leaving Roshar. I know that's a common and popular theory right now, but it just doesn't make that much sense to me. I could see some Iriali going to Scadrial, but most of them probably went to Lumar. And even if they did go to Scadrial, they were only there for what, 100 years at most before going to Lumar? I've mentioned earlier that people sail across these spore seas, but you saw my handful of rose spores. How does someone sail across something like a spore, something that's almost sand-like? Well, it has to do with something called the Seethe.
Beneath the surface of the seas, air is shot up through the spores, causing them to behave like a liquid. This air comes from two different sources, geothermal vents and the decomposition of spores.
Zabish says, if the moons are constantly pouring out spores, how do the oceans not fill up? Do they degrade eventually, or is there another method?
Yes, they degrade eventually. I'll be perfectly frank with you. My science on this, I have not gone to all of my normal science routes. The only one of the secret projects that we did a lot of the scientific work on is because of how tied into the rest of the Cosmere it is. I have some sort of plausible wiggle room on book one because Hoyt is telling the story, and he can get some things wrong. Where I am right now is the Seethe is partially involved in the way that the spores degrade. And that's part of what causes it. You got this decomposition of a fantastical sort happening deep down, and that is causing the Seethe. But I have not run the science on this. Like, Tress is me pushing the limits of, like, all of my books straddle this on this continuum between fully scientific and fully fantastical, and I tend to sit like over on this side, right, where it's like Stormlight. I'm gonna work out all of these things. But I write fantasy, and once in a while, I want to stray into the whimsical, and I purposely did it on Tress. I'm gonna push the boundaries of what I can do and still have it be reasonable that it could exist with fantastical resources, and go kind of as far whimsical as I feel comfortable doing. That isn't to say that that you should consider this non-canon. It is absolutely canon. But what it means is I didn't start with, what's the science of this? I started with, what is the really interesting story I want to tell? And let's tell the story there. And if it comes down that the science just can't work, well, the answer is a wizard did it. Right? Like, there. I have enough access to fantastical explanations for the things that happen that I can make this work. But it is me pushing the boundaries of that. And you're probably well aware of that, having read the book at this point, those who are watching. And so know that I've got general impressions, such as spores are degrading, the way that they're degrading is actually causing the Seethe, much in a kind of an accelerated version of how methane comes up through decomposition and whatnot, and that's what we're doing. But the water cycle is really tricky. I have some instincts on how that works, but I'm not even going to talk about them because I don't want to canonize that, right?
Sure.
Because the water cycle is a really tricky thing on this planet in particular.
Sanderson released a full video featuring Mark Rober about this fluidization phenomenon, and I will link that video in the description down below. It's pretty cool, definitely worth a watch.
Another terrifying quirk about the Seethe is that it occasionally stops. Sometimes it's just for a few minutes, other times hours, and in rare instances, even days. When this happens, the spores stop behaving as a fluid and act more like a sand, freezing any ships that were sailing across it until the Seethe returns. While the Seethe is stopped, it is possible to walk across the spores, but doing so runs the risk of sinking into the depths of the sea once the Seethe starts up again.
But where do these seas of spores come from? Well, the answer is the moons. The 12 moons drop spores associated with that color of moon onto the surface, creating large kind of sloping seas towards the lunagre, which is the point directly below the moon where the spores fall. This also means that the seas are kind of pentagonal in shape. The moons and the aethers that live on them might actually have names. We know that the name Thanasmia is associated with the midnight moon, and this might be the name of the moon or maybe the aether that lives on it.
Perhaps the most unique arcana associated with Lumar and these spores are the gestators. Also called Spore Eaters, a gestator is an individual whose body is infested with spores. They have a connection to the prime aether that resides on the moon, associated with the spore that has infested their body. This condition is usually fatal, as the spores pull exponentially more water from the host as the infestation progresses. How does one become a gestator? It's not entirely clear, but there are two predominant theories in world. The first is that certain people are chosen by the prime aether, and then these chosen people become gestators, who provide water through some unknown mechanic to the aether on the moon.
The other theory is that someone eats a specific and special spore after falling into the spore seas, turning them into a gestator. I think that it's actually a combination of the two. I think the moon picks someone that it wants to be their gestator, and then gives them that spore to eat, somehow gets it to them. So I think it's a combination of both.
The Spore Eater does benefit from this infestation in some ways. The spores provide some protection and some form of precognition from harm. The spores can detect intent to harm and have countermeasures, such as catching bullets, to protect their host.
With how important water is for spore activation, you're probably wondering, where do the Lumarans get their drinking water? Oh, you weren't thinking about that? Just me? All right. Anyway, water is a key ingredient for life, but it's particularly dangerous on Lumar. Strangely enough though, Lumar does have a water cycle, but it is poorly understood. So much in fact that characters in world have come to the planet to study this water cycle and figure out how it works. It's also a bit of a mystery to Sanderson himself.
We know that it rains on Lumar. In every sea but the Crimson, rain falls in predictable band-like patterns. This rain does activate spores, but because the paths are well known and understood, they don't cause that much of a problem.
What is weird to me is the presence of aquifers in places that don't receive rain. Generally, how these aquifers work is that over hundreds of years, water seeps down from the surface into these reservoirs underground. But to get there in the first place, that means that there has to have been rain or some other means for water to get there. And in a place like Diggins Point, where it doesn't rain very often, it's unclear how an aquifer could have formed in the first place for people to get their drinking water. Is it perhaps that water and rain used to be more present on Lumar, which would make sense with the abundance of salty islands and also the presence of water underground? Or is it maybe that these weather patterns have changed over time and that Diggins Point used to get rain? Larger islands are big enough to have full-on lakes in them that are deep enough for people to swim in as well as for fish to live in. But where do these bodies of water get their water from? Are there mountains on these islands that are large enough to get snow and send that water downstream? I don't know, and I don't know if we ever will know, because Sanderson doesn't really plan to write another book set on Lumar to my knowledge. And I'm not the only one with these questions. As I mentioned before, there are other world hoppers who set up shop here just to figure out how the water cycle works.
Xysis the Dragon arrived on the planet and set up a research center in the Crimson Sea. His presence quickly worked its way into local legend, and the people of Lumar have sought him out requesting boons. Other world hoppers include Nalthians, that the locals refer to as wizards, who sell and trade their awakened technology like Fort's Tablet. Kandra, Elantrians, and others have all had an interest in this world before it became important in the Cosmere Space Age. The local personification of the concept of death is known as Death with Nails in His Eyes.
Lumar is a very difficult planet for world hoppers to get to. Not only is there not a perpendicularity here, but there wasn't a planet with a known perpendicularity until pretty recently, until the discovery of the Dromonad system.
Despite this obstacle, spacefaring civilizations still took the long journey to the planet to harvest aether spores from the moons of Lumar. Zephyr Aether seems to be particularly useful in the Cosmere Space Age, as a lightweight propellant and emergency source of air. These spores are also able to be stored, but seem to lose some potency over time, becoming sleepy. For organizations that don't have access to an aether bound, the spores of Lumar seem to be an incredible resource. It also seems to be a decently contested world in the future conflicts of the Cosmere. The planet is said to be roughly equal in distance from both Roshar and Scadrial, the two galactic superpowers.
And this discovery wasn't made until late in the Cosmere's history in the Space Age. Sometimes with the grand scale of the Cosmere, it's easy to forget that there are hundreds of worlds out there just waiting to be discovered. Worlds with stories to tell and people to tell them. The planet Lumar is a reminder that there are wonders in the Cosmere outside of the major planets that we think of. Even without the direct influence of shards, there are still incredible worlds out there that often defy explanation. Worlds in the Cosmere that don't demand your attention, but certainly demand your respect. And I think that's all I've got for you now. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and comment down below what your favorite thing about Tress of the Emerald Sea is. And be sure to share this video with your friends who love the cosmere or just want to learn more about the planet from Tress of the Emerald Sea. And if you enjoy cosmere content like this and want to support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member or a Patreon member. There'll be a link to my Patreon in the description down below. And of course, a special thank to Mac and Dennis, my 2 draconic donors. I couldn't do this without you, and I appreciate it so much. But yeah, that's all I got for you now. Have an excellent time of day, and I'll catch you all next time. All right, guys. Bye.